Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. What exactly is nationhood? I'm not referring to the concept of nation or citizenship, both of which are clear enough, but what does belonging to a nation mean to different people? Nationhood is admittedly an ever changing idea and can be the driving force of great change of movements, such as the freedom struggle. How has nationhood evolved in India, and what does it mean today in these tough, divisive times to different groups?
All Indians matter.
We have on the show Priyadarshini Singh, a research fellow at the State Capacity Initiative Center for Policy Research. She works on nation making in India through state led interventions and at the grassroots. Among her projects, it was a study of the political economy of elementary education reform in India since the 1990s. But it's a recent publication, India and its Nationhood, Grassroots Nationhood as Conceptual Frames, that we will discuss today. Welcome once again to the show, Priyadarshini.
Hi, Ashraf. Glad to be here.
Priyadarshini, we live in interesting times. The concept of nationhood is being sought to be redefined, linking it to religion rather than values and social commitments. What do you make of it?
Ashraf, the linkage of nationhood with religion is not necessarily a problem and isn't as such really either unique to India or unique to that of the contemporary political period where we are. Religion-based ideas such as, say, for example, purity and values such as karm karo, fal ki ichha mat karo have defined various markers of Indian nation historically since pre-independence period. What can become alienating to significant sections is when only one religion or one religious tradition is privileged and represented in national terms. That's when things become problematic. But I must also add over here that around the world, this sort of contestation among different values, different identities, different groups, different histories is very much a part of the essence of being a nation. Nations, as leading nationalism scholars have said, both in the context of West and non-West, scholars such as John Fox in the context of Hungarian nationalism, Michael Billig in the context of American nationalism, nations are constantly in the process of making and remaking, and contestation and conflict over the meaning of the nation and what it means to be a national evolves and sort of is reshaped, and new members sort of are brought on to figure out what is it that collectively makes us a national.
A concept of nationhood that excludes vast portions of the population would lead to serious social and political turbulence. How do you think things will pan out in the long run in India?
So my research focuses on grassroots and everyday ideas of the nation for ordinary nationals. But generally, for any kind of socio-political collectivity, whether it's a nation, whether it's a federal unit, for example, a state or a caste or anything, any identity that includes a vast majority of its members will face centrifugal pressures. How will they pan out in the long run? Well, while this hasn't been the focus of my research, but homogenization of identity will be challenging to accomplish. To the extent this is attempted, it will require prominent amounts of state resources and energies, and the homogenization sort of a mission doesn't have as much of resonance also among many people. But as I said, nations are made and they are made on a continuous basis. Majorities and minorities are also constructed, and it's always that nation and national identity is sort of a coming together of different groups that form an agreement about what is a respectful and inclusive imagination of the nation.
In your study, Priyadarshini, you mentioned that according to the National Post-Poll Survey in 2019, conducted by the Center for Study of Developing Societies, just 56% of respondents identified themselves as Indian only, and a prominent 20% identified only with the state. So that's a subnational unit. On the other hand, 76% believe that India belongs to citizens of all religions equally, not just Hindus. Now, this survey was conducted in the backdrop of a massive victory of the Bharatiya Janata Party to a second term, which believes in Hindu majoritarian politics. The findings underscore inclusive nations of national identity at the grassroots, but yet there are massive electoral victories for the BJP. How do you reconcile this?
So, my research prominently highlights that there are aspects of our imaginations of the nation, of our national identity, that shape our political behavior, and there are those that don't. So, the idea of the nation is very complex and nuanced at the grassroots level among non-elites. So, to focus just on one prominent conceptualization would not give us sort of the entirety of the multiple levels and ways in which people experience their nationalness.
Right. In your study, you say essentially that nationhood is defined differently by different people. What were the broad strokes of that?
So this was a very important surprise for me. When I went into the field, I was very naively assuming that I will just sort of go there and there will be times and spaces where the nation will magically appear in front of my eyes and people will excitedly talk to me about it. And I won't have to do the hard work of deciphering what does something as complex and as old as the Indian nation would be. So what I realize is that contexts are very important with regards to how respondents talk about the nation, when they talk about the nation, and particularly when you are, in a non-ideologically charged context, like elections tend to be ideologically charged. When you're sort of going on a dusty Tuesday on a bus stand or at a tea stall, context has become very important. So, for example, when I spoke with women in front of men, their husbands or other male members, they were very reticent to talk to me about what they thought was national pride for them. Right? They were very conscious about the fact that they were not knowledgeable enough, they had not traveled enough, didn't have enough political knowledge in comparison with the men. But when I spoke with them individually, they often emphasize things like respect for women, their roles in managing families, their role in national culture as being a matter of national pride. And this was something I sort of observed across my foresight where I did field research. So, of course, this was not exclusive of other attributes of, the idea of nation, national history or the independence movement. But the context matters. So similarly, many of my Muslim respondents who were based in localities with a history of violence, they spoke about peacefulness in community relations and friendships as a matter of national pride, right? So, and the context could be anything. It could be a context of state level history. It could be a context of, that particular village, or even the fact that, I was present in the conversation. An educated city girl is, probing people who till the farm. So that shapes how people talk and think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But Priyadarshini, you say also in the study that nationhood is a journey. What do you mean by that?
I'm actually really glad that you've asked me this question because it helps me reflect a little bit on the times when I first got fascinated by nationalism and I thought of doing this research. I was studying the theories of nationalism during my master's program. The classic works of Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, where he talks about how forces of modernization like print capitalism were sort of the reasons why nations emerged historically. And then the work of Anthony Smith, The Ethnic Origins of Nation, where he says that sort of the core cultural material of an ethne is what is the basis on which the nation later on is built. And while reading all of this, I was so perplexed. I was like, why would somebody sitting in a remote village in, say, Rajasthan want to be an Indian? What purpose would it serve for them if at max the frequency with which you go to your district headquarters would be maybe once in 4 months? Forget about the state capital. Their mobility is restricted. They speak local dialects. They are closer to local cultural traditions. They are, rather than to the more sort of urbanized national culture, they sort of are not that familiar with national symbols like the parliament or the anthem, etc. They don't access newspapers as often because they're illiterate. So this curiosity was driving my interest, and I focused on this during my field research. And what I found was that across the board, across communities, the nation signified a very pure moral entity. So when somebody spoke about national pride, they took themselves very seriously when they spoke, their tone, their demeanor. If there were people around over there, they also looked up to people who were sort of able to talk about national pride in a very articulate way. And people always spoke about the nation using verbs like chalna, padhna, sudharna, pahachna. And underlying this, when I stitched the whole story together, what seemed to me was that nationhood was meaningful to everybody in exactly the same way is because it signified this ideal horizon towards which the national community is headed, one which is defined by justice and equality and dignity and socio-economic development. It was this emancipatory promise of the nation which sort of resonated across the people I spoke with. And this is sort of similar in other nationalism in the world also. I mean, as Professor Srinivasa, a professor at University College of Dublin, highlights, this is sort of a foundational aspect of, nations around the world. So instead of finding a need for socio-cultural authenticity, what I found was that the nation necessarily sort of propels us to rise above our particularity, sort of to be the bigger and the better person.
I also wanted to make the distinction between nationhood and nationalism. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So this is an important aspect that I discovered when I was in the initial phases of conceptualizing my study and I was reading both academic literature and popular media writings. I realized that nationalism is sort of this umbrella term which is used to signify the world. So it could be an anti-colonial movement, it could be an ideology, it could be a sentiment, it could be an identity, it could be a socio-political collectivity. And it was pretty much always done in the context of state-seeking nationalisms. When there are movements challenging the state integrity, or there are socio-economic movements demanding additional rights, sort of seeking a more equitable federal arrangement. What I realized, I was wondering, I'm like, so what happens once all these questions are settled, right? So you got in the state, you've put the government in place. Does nationalism sort of disappear when you're sort of taking a train ride from, I don't know, Bombay to Delhi? And this is the distinction that I make between nationhood, which is in the context of having attained the state where it is settled, there is no separatist movement happening, and there is no sort of ideologically charged context that is sort of calling people to reflect on their nationalness on a very frequent basis. Which is not to say that nationhood means everybody has become homogeneous. Like, nations have a very rich local life. People have conflicts and asymmetries and, other preoccupation instead of just thinking actively about being a national. So my research necessarily is about the story of ordinary Indians living out the life of a nation in the most dull and boring of its moments.
Yeah, I think that's extremely critical, because that is really where everyday life lies. It's not in the exceptional situations, but in the everyday situations that we face. But in this context, Priyadarshini, is it also the case that many instances of inter-community tensions are actually about economic issues or benefits rather than community issues? For instance, in your study, you say that in Rajasthan's Savai Madhopur, Gujjars were agitating for scheduled tribe status for preferential access to government schools and jobs. This pitted them against the Meena community, which was a long standing beneficiary of these positions.
Any sorts of these long-standing conflicts always are a mix of definitely economic and material consideration, but they also draw on longer historical socio-cultural differences as well. What is interesting is, and to the extent that this happens, is when they get morphed and projected onto the nation as becoming issues of national concerns when they may not necessarily be that. Maybe a very, very localized problem happening on multiple registers for various issues. But yeah, my assessment of this issue is that it's complicated at various levels. The economic and material manifestation is more visible, it's more here and now, but that's not necessarily the only axis of conflict.
Right. And what were the typical symbols of nationhood that respondents cited, and how did they differ between different groups?
So, well, I didn't find very large number of symbols of nationhood that were typical of groups, say, for example, the Lingayat community in Karnataka, or, Marathi speakers, or etc. It's possible I don't record this in the research because the research was not designed to focus on this. Something like this would require a different sort of a research design, and it's possible that it exists. But what I did find in my study, and which was again a very big surprise for me, was what I call as the markers of nation speak. Which is that, when people are talking about the nation on an ordinary sort of conversation, you're just sort of sitting in somebody's little porch ahead and it's a hot summer afternoon and you're just asking somebody, so, desh ki kis baat pe aapko garv hota hai? So, often the responses that you will get would consist of at least some ideas, for example, the idea of freedom, or historical and geographical places like, say, Jallianwala Bagh or Kashmir, or historical events like, Quit India movement, or national level leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, which respondents sort of drop in the discussion to highlight to me that, look, we are clever and smart enough, we also know about the nation. It's a bit of like, urban area name dropping that hum bhi bade logon ko jante hain. And what was really interesting, in some cases was a little hilarious, was that often people actually didn't know what this meant. I remember talking to some people in Rajasthan, they were very confused between Rajasthan and Pakistan. The only thing that they knew was, okay, somehow there is some place somewhere called Pakistan and you are not supposed to like it, right? These are obviously people much older generation, live all their time in those sort of small hamlets outside the main village. And so it was a little sort of, comical. But what was important was the fact that, or, this one conversation I had at a tea stall when I asked these two old gentlemen, and I was like, what do aap Pradesh ki kis baat pe garv hota hai? And there were lots of people around, and they so, with a lot of energy and enthusiasm said to me in a loud voice, Tirangi Jhanda. I was like, what? I had never heard the word Tirangi Jhanda said in that manner. I'd only read it in textbooks. And everybody in that instance was so much in awe of them that, wow, you really said something very pure and very much about the nation. So more than I would say symbols of nationhood, it was these sort of markers of nation speak that emerged again and again.
You also say that the concept of nationhood is denoted by interrelated conceptual frames that are used self-consciously and strategically. Could you decode that for us?
Right. So basically by conceptual frames, I mean a certain way of thinking. So what I mean to highlight here is that nationhood, instead of being, what we popularly think about it is it's sort of an ideology or a set of, shared cultural attributes around history and religion. At an everyday level, and I consciously went to my field sites looking for the nation in the everyday, right? Like I woke up in the morning and started tabulating how many times did I think about being an Indian or about India. In an everyday level, nationhood and being a national really is about a certain way in which you frame reality and certain way in which you choose to frame reality very strategically and sort of self-consciously. To give you an example, I mean, both during my fieldwork period, both Independence Day and Republic Day was spent in field sites. And if you didn't have young kids who went to school, you wouldn't know what was happening. Nobody discussed it. Nobody talked about it. There was nothing happening that sort of involved the larger public. But this didn't mean a nation would cease to exist. The capacity of an ordinary national to think nationally sort of still remain. And I'll quote a particular incident. I remember I would so I'd gone around panchayat election time, and I would ask my respondents that panchayat elections are going to happen and everybody's going to participate, and isn't it such a great thing that we can all shape our destinies through participating in local governance and shape the nation. And they were like, this is not about the nation. They literally thought of me the most idiotic person ever to walk into their lives to think panchayat elections had anything to do with the nation, right? So when I directly asked them, everybody sort of shut me up. I felt very bad. But then I was sitting at a tea stall once, and there was this conversation happening among a group of men residing in a particular locality who were very, very annoyed with at that time, the leaders of the outgoing village panchayat. And one of those members was present in that discussion, and they just spontaneously started off. They are like, panchayat ke chunav nahi hone chahiye, desh khadde mein jata hai. And I was like, what? I was like, you literally little while ago said that the panchayat elections have nothing to do with the nation. And now you're telling me that desh khadde mein jata hai because of panchayat elections. And I realized that they were saying that because they wanted to communicate their displeasure with the way the panchayat was being run with one of the members there. And this was sort of a classic example where, the nation speak was sort of invoked to, communicate a very particular grievance because they literally resided in a very small locality in the village.
And also that comes back to the point you made earlier about context being everything when it comes to these conversations.
Yes.
Yeah. You identify 3 conceptual frames of nationhood. So let's go through them one by one. Let's start with the first one, which is territory.
Right. So these frames are actually interrelated. The territory as a frame is about a very wide expanse, sort of, people's sense of, the boundedness of the nation, what ends where was very sketchy, but people knew the fact that the nation extends far beyond their known and familiar locations. And most importantly, it sort of encapsulates their birthplace or the centers of their socio-cultural communities. It's not that the whole of the nation is their birthplace and socio-cultural community center, right? It's other people also have their birthplaces and trace their histories to the same national territory. And lastly, the important thing about the nation, and this links back to the idea of the nation as being a journey, is that the national territory is defined by socio-economic development. In a good nation, you should have good roads, you should have bridges, you should have access to, healthcare and education, etc.
And what about the second now, community?
The community community is conceptualized as a community of communities, and the sub-communities are not just socio-cultural ones of caste and religion, but also socio-economic ones. So it's a community of poor and rich, land tillers and landowners. And what's important about this idea is that the national community is not a homogeneous one, either culturally or socio-economically. That there is that awareness that it's different people are located in this community in a different way. So yeah.
And now the third frame, which is political leadership.
Yeah, and this was also another one of the very surprise factors because I just realized that the capacity of an ordinary person to imagine the nation without a good democratically elected leader was just sort of not there. The nation essentially, and again linking back to the idea of nation as a journey towards the ideal horizon, was this entity that was led by a leader. वो अच्छा नेता ही सुधार सकता है, अच्छा नेता ही हमको आगे लेकर जाएगा. Again, this was what was surprising was how widespread this view was. Even, women who had never left their homes were observing parda would say to me कि नेता के बिना तो देश हो ही नहीं सकता.
Priyadarshini, I want to talk to you about one other very important part. I want to talk about inclusiveness as part of the concept of nationhood. You've written that elections are not a barometer of grassroots nationhood. So could you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of links back to my original interest in understanding nationalism at the grassroots, which was, I used to wonder whether, can the ordinary person imagine the nation outside of what the political leader or political party or media or the state is telling them? They have agency, right? Now, what's happened over some period of time is that the only time we get to figure out what the nation means to an ordinary national is when the national election results are declared, and the voting patterns are seen as a proxy for what people believe in about the nation. But the thing is that the Indians think in very complex terms because our realities are very complex. Even the most ordinary, simple of a person leads very complex life, and people have immense capacity to form their idea of the nation by drawing from various sources, right? So you could sort of draw from the unity in diversity idiom alongside saying कि और हमारे गांव में सब्जी भी बहुत अच्छी मिलती है. They can coexist. Nobody thinks of it as being contradictory. And I think multiple survey researchers have also highlighted this, and one of them is that 2021, the Pew Research data said that close to 80% of the respondents hold that respecting diversity is not just core to being an Indian, but it is also core to their being members of their respective communities, such as Hindus, Muslims, Christians. So, a good Muslim or a good Hindu is one who respects diversity.
Tell us some of your favorite stories during your research. You already told us a couple, but tell us some more.
Okay, so this one this memory will go with me to my dying day because it's vivid as it happened yesterday. So this was my first fieldwork site. It was in Rajasthan, and after I think a couple of weeks of realizing that I'm not able to get across to a lot of women to talk to me, and to discuss these things with me, I was put in touch with this illiterate Muslim woman in Rajasthan, and my God, was she a hurricane? I think in the early few days, I was a little intimidated of her. And she would sort of charge into people's homes and gather everybody together, all the women there, everybody from, 18, 19-year-old first-time voters to really older women, and make them speak with me. But what was the most distinctive of my interactions with her was the first time I spoke with her when I was introduced to her. So this was a setting in one of the village residents' living room, small cramped room, with one of her friends, and my landlord and landlady. Both of these two were educated. They were, they belonged to dominant communities there and were sort of financially better off. The woman respondent was very poor. Her husband didn't do anything. She owned a very small patch of land, and half of her house was made of mud. And I asked everybody, what do you think about the nation? Desh ki kis baat pe garv hota hai and all that. And I was sort of very hesitant asking her because I thought ki ye to kya hi bolengi and itne sab log hain yahan pe. She charged on and she sort of took on everybody and corrected their narrative of what national pride was. She told them, देश की बात पे हमको इस बात पे गर्व होना चाहिए कि हम मिलजुल के रहते हैं, एक साथ रहते हैं, हमेशा से रहते आ रहे हैं, और दूसरी जगह पे क्या होता है इससे हमें कोई मतलब नहीं है, यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है आप वो बताइए. I was like, oh my god. It was such a beautiful narrative where she sort of linked up her everyday, very, very local life with how that was enriching her sense of being a part of a national. Now, I mean, obviously, she's living a difficult life. Obviously, she faces, as most people in village settings face, they face discrimination and etc. But that was not the reality she was sort of foisting onto the nation. It was the fact that, well, this is where I am, and I'm good with that.
It's a beautiful narrative indeed, Priyadarshini. So let me ask you something that I ask all my guests at the end of the conversation. Why do you do this work?
Because I think we need to understand how people live together despite differences in diversity. And I think there'll always be differences. Always. And we are stuck here for better or for worse. So, yeah.
No doubt about it. Priyadarshini, thanks so much for talking to us about a polarizing but very important subject, especially in these times. Thanks also for sharing the findings of your research with us.
Thanks so much, Ashraf. I would sort of really urge the listeners of this podcast to read my paper, Indian Nationhood at the Grassroots, which was published by Nation the Nationalism Journal. It's available online, and in case you have any challenges in accessing it, please feel free to write to me and I will share a copy. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINEER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.